The Allied invasion of Normandy is without a doubt the most important operation in World War II. Its sheer scale, the number of troops involved, and its strategic importance were unparalleled. This was the day when Germany started to lose the war, but such a victory came at a price. When the landings were over, the German army retreated and the Allied armies were moving inland towards Paris. They left behind a gruesome landscape. 10,000 bodies between Allied and German lay on the beaches of Normandy. And that was only the first day. Dozens of films, series, and videos have portrayed the epic combat of D-Day, but few people talk about its aftermath. What happened to the dead bodies and the scattered body parts? Who was in charge of their identification? How were they buried or sent to their loved ones back home? Welcome to the Marshall Memoirs. Operation Overlord, From Hell to Victory. The 6th of June, 1944. A day that will forever be remembered as D-Day. Thanks to an enormous effort of secrecy and planification, the combined forces of every Allied nation managed to attack the Nazis where they least expected it. This led to a dramatic shift in the direction of the war. It is generally accepted that prior to the Normandy landings, the outcome of the war was unsure, or even slightly leaning towards a Nazi victory. The Thousand-Year Reich was still strong, France was little more than Hitler's puppet state, and the Soviet Union was barely repelling the Nazi offensive, with the loss of 3.3 million people to military operations and famine. It was in this context that General Bernard Montgomery told Franklin D. Roosevelt first and Winston Churchill later about his idea of a massive landing of troops in the north of France. Against all odds, he managed to convince them that it was not only possible, but the only chance to win the war against an opponent that already controlled almost all of Europe. They nicknamed this extremely secret and dangerous mission Operation Overlord. Planning began in 1943, but only the following year the Allied command led by Dwight D. Eisenhower acknowledged that the conditions were propitious for Operation Overlord to take place. The rest is history. The Normandy landings were the largest seaborne invasion in history, with nearly 5,000 landing and assault craft, 289 escort vessels, and 277 minesweepers participating. During D-Day, nearly 160,000 troops crossed the English Channel. This number increased the following days, with 875,000 men disembarking by the end of June. Allied casualties were, just on that first day, at least 10,000, with 4,414 confirmed dead. It is calculated that the Germans sustained between 5,000 and 9,000 casualties, either killed, wounded, missing, or captured. Of course, in the heat of battle, it is impossible to stop and recover the bodies. Allied infantry had orders to keep pushing forward no matter what. And so they did. They charged inland under the relentless enemy gunfire and mortar charges. Soon, the beaches of Normandy, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, were littered with the bodies of Allied soldiers, either dead or dying. Until a beachhead was established, there was nothing their comrades could do for them. The 24,000 Canadian, American, and British airborne troops who were dropped 500 feet or 150 meters over Normandy were especially vulnerable to enemy fire. Many of them did not reach ground alive, or worse still, plummeted to earth with their parachutes torn apart by German bullets. Advancing through the beach was an almost impossible task. Not only they faced constant enemy fire and shelling, they had to avoid naval mines, land mines, iron and concrete anti-tank structures scattered across the beaches, and now the bodies of their fallen comrades. So the question remains, what happened to the bodies? After some of the most grueling and cruel battles in World War II, the beaches of Normandy were the place on Earth closer to hell. It was a surreal landscape of brutality and gore. Now the Allied forces had basically 4 tasks that needed to be done regarding the corpses. These were recovery, identification, burial, and notifying their loved ones. Not one of those tasks was easier than the rest, and they all required morally strong people. The United States Army established a graves registration service. The EREs took care of these jobs and others, including selecting an appropriate site for a temporary cemetery, digging all the graves, and the proper marking of the graves so that the bodies could be identified later. These men and women were the unsung heroes of D-Day, who secured that the memory of the fallen would remain alive for generations to come. Also, they were instrumental in helping the families who lost their members overseas to cope with the loss. Why were the Normandy landings possible? Hitler was so convinced of his victory that he took a false step by invading the Soviet Union. This was done in violation of a previous non-aggression pact signed in Moscow in 1939. Not only did Stalin look the other way when Hitler invaded Poland in September 1939, but he supplied Germany with wheat, oil, cotton, and other raw materials in exchange for weapons and other machinery. 2 years later, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa. The objective was to advance rapidly into enemy territory and take Moscow within just a few weeks. In the process, Germany would gain access to all the raw materials and food needed to sustain the war effort without having to give anything in exchange. Stalin immediately joined the Allies and started convincing Eisenhower and Churchill that another theater of operations should be opened in the West. But where? Most of Europe's coast was heavily defended, thanks to what was known as the Atlantic Wall. The Atlantic Wall was an extensive system of coastal defenses and fortifications built between 1942 and 1944, using mainly French slave workforce. More than 500,000 French workers were drafted to build this complex system of bunkers, trenches, casemates, concrete pillboxes, and hundreds of thousands of anti-tank gun nests. Land and naval mines, as well as anti-tank obstacles, were placed in the beaches of Europe. The Atlantic Wall covered most of the coast of continental Europe and Scandinavia in anticipation of an expected Allied invasion from the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom was Germany's closest enemy, at least until Operation Barbarossa begun in 1941. The manning and operation of the Atlantic Wall was administratively overseen by the German army, with some support from Luftwaffe ground forces. The German Navy, or Kriegsmarine, maintained a separate coastal defense network, organized into a number of sea defense zones. Hitler signed his Führer Directive No. 40 in 1942, ordering the construction of the fortifications. The wall was frequently mentioned in Nazi propaganda, where its size and strength were usually exaggerated. The fortifications included colossal coastal guns, batteries, mortars, and artillery, and thousands of artillery pieces were stationed in its defenses. And although it was quite impressive, the sheer length of the European coast made it a very tall order. It was agreed that defenses should be made stronger where an Allied disembark was more likely to occur. Normandy was picked precisely because it was the most unlikely place of all, with all their easily defendable cliffs overlooking the beach. This made the German army overlook this area and instead focus on defending other, more likely spots. The Pas-de-Calais area was one of the more obvious choices, being the part of continental France that was closer to the British Isles. The Allies knew this, and they also knew that it was almost impossible to keep an operation of such a massive scale a secret for a long time. This is why they devised Operation Bodyguard, a large-scale series of deceptions designed to mislead the Germans about the invasion. For instance, they put in place a misinformation campaign using fake radio traffic to lead the Germans into expecting an attack on Norway. Also, they created a fictitious United States Army group under Lieutenant General George S. Patton, supposedly located in Kent and Sussex. The aim of this operation was to lead the Germans into believing that the main attack would take place at Calais. Genuine radio messages from the 21st Army Group were first routed to Kent via landline and then broadcast, to give the Germans the impression that most of the Allied troops were stationed there. After the main landing at Normandy on June 6th, Patton remained stationed in England for a full month, thus continuing to deceive the Germans into believing a second attack would take place at Calais. Patton was, of course, one of the most renowned generals in the Allied army, and the Nazis would be hard-pressed to believe that such an elaborate and large-scale operation would be done without him. But that is exactly what the Allied command did. The deceptions of Operation Bodyguard worked just as perfectly as the landings of Operation Overlord, and for this reason, as its name suggests, it saved the lives of perhaps hundreds of thousands. Dying in the battlefield, a soldier's worst nightmare. No matter how much effort is placed into seeking historical accuracy, real warfare is very different from the movies. In combat, there is simply no time to stop and do anything with the ones who died on the spot, so the soldiers that still can fight have no choice but to leave them there. Some of them were lucky and found their way to the field aid station, or were carried there by another soldier. These stations were often located where the medic just happened to be, usually under cover behind a wall or at the foot of the cliff. Far back at sea, there were medical ships with facilities for tending to the wounded, but for some of them who were badly hurt, it was a miracle to be taken back to the medical ships alive. These boats did not have a mortuary, so those who died aboard were carefully noted and dropped into the ocean, with a heavy weight attached so that the bodies did not hamper navigation in the area. Those who survived were sent back to England, America, or Canada, where they were received as heroes. Beyond those who left the battlefield as prisoners or never left it alive at all, hundreds of thousands of men were more or less seriously wounded. Indeed, for an infantryman to remain uninjured until July 1944 was considered an exceptional achievement. Most of the men who landed in Normandy were wounded at one point or another. The doctors and medical teams handled hundreds of cases each day, most of them very serious. Many men lost limbs or became permanently handicapped, but for others who were only lightly wounded, being sent home for medical reasons was a ticket to paradise. It meant they had escaped the battlefield with honor, and they could be relieved that they had done their job without disgracing themselves. For most men, the need to continue the job to sustain their own self-respect was the principal motive force upon the battlefield. The battles at Normandy were relatively severe compared with later battles in World War II. Hospital admissions as a result of enemy action comprised 9.7% of British soldiers engaged in the first 3 months after the invasion. Psychiatric casualties reached a high of 14 per 1,000 among the British in the same period, falling to 11 per 1,000 by winter. Although battle fatigue never reached epidemic proportions in the British Army, every unit in Normandy suffered its share of men who found themselves utterly unwilling to endure more. There are reports of men who simply shot themselves in the foot rather than endure the assault at Normandy. One of the most important lessons that were learned in World War II, something which had not been contemplated in World War I, was the acknowledgement that each man possessed a limit beyond which he could not be forced. It was merely vital to ensure that such problems did not become epidemic. For this reason, commanding officers were lenient towards those who suffered shell shock or other psychological ailments. They were no longer considered cowards, but simply common men who had reached their limits and were not fit for the line of battle. They were given tasks away from battle. Some soldiers were superstitious about picking up a dead man's weapon, although few were above looting a German Luger pistol if they found one. Almost every man had his private equivalent of touching wood, his secret luck charm. Men were frequently shocked by the speed at which an entire unit could be transformed into a ruin on the battlefield. It was sometimes a matter of minutes, after which a few lucky soldiers would find themselves among piles of their comrades' bodies. Each night, one of the most painful tasks for the commanding officer of every unit was to write to the families of his men who had died. Most widows and mothers bore the news with pathetic resignation. A few were bitter. They all understood that their sons and husbands died in the line of duty, fighting for a better world. Never seen again, burials at sea. Even worse than dying on the beaches of Normandy was drowning to death in the black waters of the English Channel, not only because it was a horrible way to die, but because there was a chance their bodies would never be found. The first challenge faced by troops sent to Normandy was reaching the beach. This was no easy feat, as the treacherous waters of the English Channel made sailing very difficult. In fact, weather was a very important factor in the success of Operation Overlord. Allied command needed to wait until there was a full moon and clear skies, helping airborne and ground visibility. Luckily, the highest tides came with the full moon, but still the landings had to be carefully calculated to be between the low and the high tide, with the tide coming in. This would give sailing vessels ample time for doing the whole operation. Also, a higher tide meant a shorter beach, which would minimize the exposure of men to enemy fire coming in from the sea. Naturally, all these conditions were only met once or twice per month. Until that happened, the whole operation needed to be on standby. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower picked the 5th of June 1944 as a tentative date for the invasion. When weather reports came with storm forecasts for that date, it was decided to postpone it just one day. If that day also failed, they would have to try again the following month, which meant a higher risk. When the day came, the weather conditions were good for the operation, but bad for the men. There was a strong current that caused the whole flotilla to drift east, so every coxswain and captain had to constantly fight the tidal current in order to stay in place, waiting for the orders to start their mission. Infantrymen had to wait for up to 12 or 14 hours crammed inside their open-sky landing craft, wet, silent, and ready for a fight. The naval invasion was one of the most impressive operations in the history of warfare. The invasion fleet, drawn from 8 different country navies, comprised 7,000 vessels. There were 1,213 warships, 4,126 landing craft of various types, 736 ancillary craft, and 864 merchant vessels. The majority of the fleet was supplied by the United Kingdom, which provided 892 warships and 3,261 landing craft. In total, there were 195,700 naval personnel involved, not counting the ground troops that were embarked. Of these, 112,824 were from the Royal Navy, with another 25,000 from the Merchant Navy. 52,889 were American, and 4,998 sailors came from other Allied countries. Floating vessels were a ripe target for ground fire, air attacks, and naval mines. It was also calculated that 124 German U-boats were patrolling the English Channel. Just before dawn, at 5:10 a.m., a barrage of torpedoes reached the Norwegian destroyer Svena off Sword Beach and barely missed British battleships HMAS Warspite and Ramillies. Allied losses to mines included the American destroyer USS Corrie off Utah Beach and submarine chaser USS PC-1261, a 173-foot patrol craft. In total, from D-Day to the end of operations in September, a total of 63 Allied boats were sunk. This include 14 destroyers, 2 frigates, 3 corvettes, a patrol boat, 20 small craft including patrol boats and speedboats, transport ships, mine layers, and landing ships. Once the invasion began and the Nazis were alerted of the Allied operation, the sea next to Normandy became a burning hell. Those who were embarked could see very little except smoke and explosions. The landing craft skippers, who were coming and going between the ships and the coast, transporting batch after batch of infantrymen, had to maneuver between sinking, burning ships, naval mines and other obstacles, and debris floating around the bay. They could also see men floating around, some wearing life jackets and others clinging to their lives. Frequently, those same men would not be there when the landing craft passed again on the same spot. It is unclear how many Allied staff died at sea that day and the following weeks, but the number may be above 1,000. Most of their bodies were never recovered and still lie at the bottom of the English Channel. Identifying the bodies, a gruesome but necessary task. For those bodies who were found on the beach, the first step towards their processing was identification. This is where the Graves Registration Service entered into play. A battleground, and especially one as bloody and ghastly as the Normandy beaches, was highly chaotic. People who were shot remained where they were shot, but those who were caught by a cannon or mortar round were seldom in one piece. The mortuary affairs teams were tasked with gathering all the bodies in a central location. This included body parts, but these were frequently discarded into a common grave and later on brought to a crematorium. The job of picking up body parts and dragging dead soldiers across the beach to the designated spot was so distressing that mortuary affairs teams usually ordered German prisoners of war to do it. This included both German and Allied bodies, which were treated the same way. After carefully sweeping the area, and once they made sure to not have missed anything, the remains were relocated to a tent next to freshly dug graves. The process of identification was made easier by the extensive use of dog tags, both by the Nazis and the Allied armies. Any personal items that were found within a body were put in a special bag. From there, they would fill out an internment form. Next, the team would find out where the rest of the soldiers' belongings were, either on a troop ship or back at the base in England. These ships and bases would be informed so they could also pack the belongings in a special bag and inventory them. At the beach, different trenches were dug, where the fallen soldiers were deposited according to their religion and whether they belonged to the German or Allied armies. This was for the purpose of the funeral services that were held on site. The division chaplains of different religions were called to bless the souls of the departed. On the first day after D-Day, 800 bodies were recovered and received these blessings. Religion was among the information that was embossed in the dog tags. Dog tags were first introduced in December 1906 by the American Army. At first, it was only a piece of metal with the name and the company, but in July 1916, a second dog tag was introduced. This was done as a response to the cruelty of World War I, which famously featured trench warfare and a generalized use of explosives like it was never before seen. Thus, it was important to identify the army men at all times. One of the dog tags would remain with the body always, but the other could be detached and used for reference or as a memento for the family of the deceased. Dog tags have been part of the American soldier's uniform since 1928 and must be worn at all times. The official dog tags at the beginning of World War II required the engraving of many different types of information: name, service number, date of tetanus inoculation, blood type, name of person to notify, and finally, religion. It was made of a copper-nickel alloy that was cheap and durable. Later identification tags were made of steel or stainless steel, but the shortages during World War II made this impossible. In other armies, the dog tags are one piece with the information embossed twice and an indentation in the middle so that it could be divided in two whenever needed. This happened when the soldier died. His commanding officer or whoever was closer to him would take one half of the tag and bring it back to base. One final use of dog tags became very popular during the Vietnam War. Since then, they are traditionally part of the makeshift battlefield memorials soldiers created for their fallen comrades. The Casualties rifle with bayonet affixed is stood vertically atop the empty boots, with the helmet over the rifle's stock. The dog tags hang from the rifle's handle or trigger guard. During World War II, however, other uses of the dog tag were strictly prohibited, as every duplicate tag needed to be brought back to the country of origin of the soldier, burying the bodies but keeping the memory alive. Today, facing the sea on Omaha Beach, there is a large memorial for all the people that died during D-Day. 9,388 white Lhasa marble headstones stand in perfect alignment on a neat lawn tended by some 20 gardeners. There is no hierarchy between the tombs. Generals and conscripts lie side by side. On the Latin crosses or stars of David are simply etched their name, rank, fighting unit, state of enlistment, official date of death, and military identity plate number. Their age is not mentioned so that the death of a very young man cannot be pitied more than that of a great elder. Mostly, however, were very young. The average age of all the soldiers that died on D-Day was 22. Those killed in action frequently had more than one burial. This was done primarily to hide the odors of the decomposing bodies. This way, as soon as the division chaplains performed the rites of passage over the dead in the trenches, they were interred in individual pits. These were no more than 3 feet in depth. It was assumed that all such hasty burials would be reinterred by the graves registration platoon as soon as they began operation in the area, but weeks could pass before this happened. During the whole Operation Overlord, a dozen makeshift cemeteries were built to pay respects to the tens of thousands of dead soldiers. The moving of bodies was done by volunteers at first, and by prisoners of war later. Eventually, the Allied command used bulldozers to comb the beach and sweep all the bodies they could find. The 8 bulldozers utilized in Normandy belonged to the 299th Combat Engineer Battalion. Reports from D-Day claim that when they finished the job, the trenches had not been dug still, so there was no place to put the bodies. Eventually, fearing a fast decomposition in the heat of European summer, it was decided to dig a temporary mass grave. One of the bulldozers did this, and soon after some officers began piling up the bodies inside the mass grave and covering them with sand afterwards. From that point on, and using the free bulldozers, they began to build the cemetery. This was mainly the task of the combat engineers, who worked with picks and shovels while the bulldozers did the heavy lifting. Still, this was not enough. The engineers had permission by the Allied command to use detachments of soldiers, prisoners of war, and even local civilians. Together, they built the first cemetery in the beaches of Normandy. It was a very simple installation, but the sheer scale of the operation required hundreds of workers. Almost 10,000 people were buried in one single day. In the medical tent, physicians were performing the difficult task of placing each body in a bag and marking it. Of course, there were not enough army body bags for all the dead soldiers, so some of them were covered in a poncho, a blanket, or even a mattress cover. They were buried in the shallow graves in those makeshift coffins. Each individual grave was marked with a temporary marker. This is where the image of a helmet sitting on the top of a rifle became famous, but most often the markers were just a name on a stick. Only in the later definitive burials, real crosses and stars of David were used. The numbers provided by the Graves Registration Service are chilling. According to them, in the Battle of Normandy, that is, Between the original landing on the 6th of June until every beachhead was established, more than 30,000 bodies were processed and buried in the provisional cemeteries. Of those, 21,705 were Americans, including 345 unidentified soldiers. There were also 131 Allied soldiers, of which 105 were successfully identified, and 11,722 enemy soldiers. Here, identification was a much more difficult task, so the total came to 9,384 German soldiers identified and 2,338 unidentified. They too deserved a proper burial. Notifying the families, a harrowing duty. The last duty of the Graves Registration Service is to notify the names of each person killed in action, and sometimes the circumstances of them. This was the easiest part, because it meant only transmitting information to all the commanding officers. Then, those responsible for the company would forward that information until the division headquarters hears of the total tally of casualties. The manpower branch collects information about every deceased and types out letters of bereavement to the fallen soldier's family, signed by the division commander or other ranking staff officer. Then came the terribly unpleasant job of visiting the family by members of the personnel branch. Usually a call may be made first in advance for the family to expect the news. To this day, the American Army prefers to deal with this type of notifications face-to-face. The difference is that now an accompanying para-counselor or a psychologist will be there for grief counseling. A financial assistance scheme would be extended to the family as well to help them tide over this difficult period. Sometimes the visiting officer will bring the family the soldier's belongings or at least their dog tag. There was a very precise protocol for dealing with the dead soldier's personal effects. Only those items found on the remains were considered personal effects, which the soldier carried with them at all times. The Graves Registration Service had the main responsibility of securing these items and carefully inventory them. Then they would be bagged, marked, and 2 inventory sheets were attached, one inside the pouch and one outside. Then they would be sent to the Graves Registration Service headquarters, where they were checked. If all contents were in order, the pouches were relocked, resealed and convoyed by hand to the next higher echelon or base command, where final check will be made. Finally, the pouches with the personal effects were shipped to the effects quartermaster in Kansas City, Missouri. That was the final stop before being able to send them to the families. But what happened to all the effects that were not considered personal? That is, the photographs, books, letters, mementos, and other objects which were kept in the barracks and not on the bodies of GIs. The commanding officers had complete liberty with these objects. The clothes, uniforms, and other items which could be reused were usually reassigned to other soldiers. Whenever it was possible, clothes were removed from their barracks to use in the burial procedure. There are reports of soldiers stealing their dead comrades' belongings, but this was a rare occurrence. For the most part, it was common practice for their friends or close comrades to take hold of these belongings so that they could bring them to the families once the war was over. This was also a way of having something to look forward to, something that was worth fighting and staying alive for. Those belongings that nobody claimed were disposed of, although there was no protocol for that. Due to the specific characteristics of World War II, many strong friendships formed on the battlefield and during deployment. There are countless stories of soldiers hanging on to precious mementos of their dead friends, only to hand them over to the families afterwards. However, we may never know most of those stories if the soldiers carrying the mementos were killed in action as well. Operation Overlord, an open-air slaughterhouse. Operation Overlord, also known as the Battle of Normandy, was an umbrella code name for several smaller operations. Operation Bodyguard, as we have seen earlier, was the deception campaign that made the Nazis look away from Normandy. The specific D-Day landings were codenamed Operation Neptune. The French conducted several airborne missions named Operation Dingson and Sam West, and so on. Thus, although it is best known for its first day, the whole Operation Overlord lasted for more than 2 months and included the liberation of France, which was achieved on the 25th of August, when Allied troops finally took Paris. General Eisenhower finally put an end to Operation Overlord on the 30th of August 1944. Those 2 months were filled with bloody battles and violent skirmishes between Allied companies and the German army, and casualties piled up by the minute. That way, D-Day was just one small part of the liberation of France. In total, between the disembark at Normandy and the liberation of Paris in August 1944, more than 500,000 people were killed or incapacitated, a big price to pay for the freedom of France. Of those, the estimated total battle casualties for Germany were 320,000, including 30,000 killed, 80,000 wounded, and 210,000 missing. More than 70% of the missing were eventually reported to be in Allied prisoners of war camps. The estimated total battle casualties for the United States were 135,000, including 29,000 killed and 106,000 wounded and missing. Although the numbers of their dead were similar, thanks to the element of surprise, the Allies were able to place more than 2 million troops in France. The Nazis, still busy fighting the Red Army in Russia, only had 640,000 troops in total at their strongest. The estimated total battle casualties for the United Kingdom were 65,000, including 11,000 killed and 54,000 wounded or missing. Canada had 18,000 casualties, including 5,000 killed and 13,000 wounded or missing. Finally, France's casualties included between 25,000 and 39,000 civilians killed or missing, half of them in pre-invasion bombings and the other half during the invasion. The combined battle casualties of the Normandy invasion were 550,200. The Battle of Normandy was exceptionally cruel, but not every unit suffered the same risks. There was a brutally self-evident hierarchy of risk among the armies. Naturally, the lowest risk was experienced by lines of communication troops and heavy artillery. Then came field artillery and armored units and engineers, and the highest risk was placed on infantry. Of the British forces in Normandy by August 1944, 56% were classified as fighting troops rather than service elements. Just 14% were infantrymen, against 18% gunners, and 13% engineers. Even within an infantry battalion, a man serving heavy weapons with the support company possessed a markedly greater chance of survival than one serving in a rifle company. It was here that the losses, turnover of officers and men, became appalling, far more serious than the planners had allowed for, and eventually reached crisis proportions in Normandy for the American, German, and British armies. Before D-Day, the American logisticians had calculated that around 70.3% of their casualties would be sustained among infantry. Yet in the event, out of 100,000 American casualties in June and July, 85% were infantry and 63% riflemen. The British forecast casualties on the basis of staff tables known as the Yvette's rates, which categorized levels of action as intense, normal, and quiet. After the Army's early experiences in Normandy, it was found necessary to introduce a new scale to cover heavy fighting, double intense. This is indeed the best way to refer to what combat was like in Normandy and gives a glimpse at how heroic those storming the beaches were. Frontline soldiers were acutely aware of the risk they faced. This is why many men found it intolerable to send prisoners to the rear, knowing that they would thus survive the war, while they themselves seemed to be marching into their own deaths. There are several reports that many British and American units shot SS prisoners routinely, which explained, as much as the fanatical resistance that the SS so often offered, why so few appeared in prisoners of war camps. The difficult task of liberating Allied prisoners of war. As the Allied troops started moving towards Paris, they came across several camps for prisoners of war, or POW. The acronym RAMP stands for Recovered Allied Military Personnel, and it refers to those wounded in action and the ones who were kept in POW camps. A series of orders were enacted after Operation Overlord in order to care for the soldiers that were being liberated. There were also several Allied military personnel who were found in German hospitals, where they were undergoing diverse treatments. These were ordered to stay put until it was safe for them to be taken over by their respective Allied governments. The War Department procedures assigned primary responsibility for the evacuation of American, British, and other Allied prisoners of war interned more than 60 days. A document called Eclipse Memorandum No. 8 outlined the procedures to be followed by the liberating army before the prisoners of war were to be evacuated from their prison camps. The liberating forces were to prepare a roster of all POWs in the camps they overran, and an identification card to each newly liberated POW. Former prisoners of war were also encouraged to write home as soon as possible, although mail was censored to prevent the release of unauthorized casualty or intelligence information. Memorandum Number 8 further provided that sick and wounded POWs would have first priority for evacuation from forward areas. All were to be evacuated by air, or if air was not available, by train. Once evacuated from the battlefield, former prisoners of war were immediately supplied with food, clothing, bedding, and toilet articles at the reception camps, and then transported as soon as possible after receiving these articles to the embarkation staging areas. Intelligence screening was one of the primary functions to be performed at the staging area. This consisted of interviews designed to determine if there were any Nazi spies or sympathizers among the liberated POWs. It was a common practice among the Germans who spoke fluent English to try to mix among the POW camp's detainees. Each former prisoner of war was also entitled to monetary help by their country's government. Advance or partial payments were issued until final payment could be arranged. No former prisoner of war would be allowed to embark by ship or air without presenting his ID card. Ramps needed to have their bodies, clothing, and personal baggage disinfected by spraying. Only then their IDs would be stamped, allowing them to take a transport back home. Unlike what one would expect, the Allied armies were in no hurry to evacuate the ramps immediately. Almost all American POWs were evacuated from their prison camps during the closing months of the war in Europe, from April through June of 1945. Before the end of the war, the Allied POWs recovered in camps overrun were ordered to remain in place under the command of their already appointed leaders. The reason for this policy was to allow the Western Allies enough time to prepare for an orderly evacuation. It was a known policy of the Nazis to take their POWs with them when they retreated, or to relocate them to other camps in territories still under their command. Furthermore, because of the Soviet advance from the east, overrunning many of the camps, it became more and more difficult to retrieve and access the American and British prisoners of war, causing additional hardships on the prisoners. The Allied High Command estimated in 1945 that the Soviet forces would uncover approximately 134,000 British and American POWs and about 425,000 PWs of other nations during their final offensive towards Berlin. Only when the war was over, POWs were allowed to slowly return home. They were first sent to reception camps established at Reims and Epinal in France, Namur in Belgium, and Borghorst in Germany. Another important camp was located in Saint Valery, 45 miles or 60 kilometers from the port of Le Havre, which came to be known as Camp Lucky Strike. It was the largest camp for ramps, and at one point held over 58,000 ramps, all captured soldiers who were eager to go back home. Camp Lucky Strike was just the first of a series of so-called cigarette camps, because they took their names from famous brands of cigarettes. In total, more than 80,000 POWs were sent home when the war was over. 73,175 were sent through Camp Lucky Strike, 5,942 were evacuated to Great Britain, and 2,858 were evacuated through Odessa by Soviet authorities. After the heat of battle dissipated, came some of the most important tasks the Allied army had to face in Normandy. Hundreds of men and women worked tirelessly not only to give their fallen comrades a proper burial, but to preserve their memory alive. Manipulating dead bodies and having to identify body parts and gore was not for the faint of heart, and these men and women must be considered as heroic as those who stormed the beaches under enemy fire on the 6th of June 1944. Everything from giving the deceased an honorary burial to making sure their personal effects reached their families and that their loved ones were correctly informed of their deaths was of an enormous importance to the families. But the knowledge that they would be taken good care of if they were killed also had a positive psychological outcome in the infantrymen that participated in D-Day.